How's Mike?
Doing good. How are you?
I am doing well. I see a note about new podcast gear in said outline.
I think maybe I texted you a picture when I got this thing because I was so excited about it anyways. But yeah, I am running all of my audio stuff now through a channel strip, which is a DBX 286S, which I had no idea what it was until I started getting frustrated because I didn't have enough gain in my Audient ID4 interface to power the Shure Beta 87A the way I wanted it to. I was getting a lot of like hissing in the background, and you can remove that after the fact, but it just bugged me every time I recorded anything.
Right.
So I started looking at preamps. Preamps are really expensive, turns out.
Yep.
I quickly was priced out of my price range and found this thing, and it was so cheap audio gear wise. It was like $200. I was like, there's no way this thing works. But I have a local audio place nearby me that I think I've mentioned before, Pixel Per Audio. And I really like those guys. They know what they're talking about, and they basically will sell me anything. And if I don't like it for any reason, I'll just bring it back because they know I'll be back again later.
Yeah. There you go.
So they said, yeah, take it for a spin. And I really like it. The thing I really like about this, in addition to the preamp, which makes my mic sound better, there's a couple of things that happen prior to the audio even getting to my interface. So before it even gets into Logic, it's already got a little bit of compression. It's already got a little bit of a de-essing, so it's less harsh. It's got a little bit of an enhancement, not a whole lot. Thing I absolutely love about it, though, is this expander gate. And since you have kids at home who may or may not decide to melt down whenever you record something,
Yep.
you should look into this too, because this noise gate is magical. I have this little light on my channel strip right below my monitor. It's red most of the time, which is where I have it set. So anything in the background, like the hum of the air conditioner or whatever, you're not going to hear. When I start talking, it turns green, letting the sound in. But what I can't figure out how this even is possible is that it does a phenomenal job of removing all of the background noise, even when the noise gate is open and it's recording my audio. I'm not an audio engineer, so I have no idea how it does it, but it's magic.
Yeah. Basically, it drops out anything that's under a certain decibel range. That's fundamentally how it works. So anything that, say you have it set at, I'm trying to recall a normal number on it because I know where it sits on the gauge whenever I work on audio, but it's like 2, 3, maybe 5 decibels, maybe it's even up to 10 sometimes. But it's basically dropping anything below that level out entirely, so that way it doesn't ever make it into the final recording or out into the system.
All I know is that I don't have to worry about any more people making noise in the background. Like, my kids can be playing literally outside my office door, and you would not hear them with this thing. It's crazy.
I will also say that the Shure Beta 87A that you are now using, right? That's the right mic?
Yep.
That's also the mic that I'm on currently. And those particular microphones, if you get the gain set correctly on those, they do a pretty good job of dropping out anything that's not right on the mic as well. So depending on how you have your settings on it, like I'm not using a gate or a limiter on mine at all, and I've managed to fine tune the gain and compressor on it such that it drops a lot of that stuff out. So for those listening, if you're not into audio gear or any audio engineering at all, this is all Greek. I'm sorry.
But if you do any recording at all ever, go buy yourself a DBX 286S now and thank me later.
Or buy a soundboard. So here's the other route you can go, Mike. So you went that direction, which is totally cool. And depending on how you want it set up, that is the better route, depending on what you want to accomplish. On my end, I simply bought a full-on soundboard that has a built-in compressor. It's got the whole EQ settings. I can run effects on it if I wanted to, but it comes with preamps and a lot of gain to it. So mics like a Heil PR40, that thing is super gain hungry, and like you can run those on this particular one. With the Beta 87, like it's fairly gain hungry too, not nearly as much, I don't think. But even on this particular board, like I can drop the pad off of it and run it at like a quarter on it, so I still got a 75% higher I could go with this particular one. So It's and what am I using? It's the Behringer 1204 USB. So it's a USB soundboard. So I'm running everything through that. And because it's a full soundboard, I actually pull the output off of my computer and run it as a separate input into that board. And then I'm picking and choosing what I want to go into my headphones out of all of that. So I'm like treating my output on it like a full monitor setup. So that's way more information than most people wanted, but that's the route that I'm going to get a lot of those features. But you have a lot more in your setup than what I do.
Yeah, but nobody cares about that. What they really care about is the bookmarks that you mentioned in the last episode. So I have follow-up for this also.
Okay.
I think I sent you a picture, but I have bookmarks right here. I'm going to grab one. Okay. Wave it in front of the microphone. You can't hear it. That's a Bookworm bookmark. On the front, it has the logo, and it says the internet's largest book club with a disclaimer that this is all me and you assume no responsibility. And then on the back, there's the Bookworm logo with the glasses, like the long, skinny one on the top of the website. And these are not just your run-of-the-mill, cheap little bookmarks. These are 2x6, so they're 2 inches wide and then 6 inches tall. And they are the thickest cardboard mat I could find from U-printing. So I think they start at like 8 or 10, and I'm like, I don't want some flimsy little bookmark to be marking my page in my books. I'm going to go all out.
Yeah. So
I have these are 16-pound or whatever the matte ones, and they're really nice. They don't bend. They're not going to get ruined just because you're using them in normal day-to-day use. Also, it turns out when you order stuff off of the internet, if you buy like 100 of them, it's fairly expensive. If you buy like 1,000, it's only a couple bucks more. So I have 1,000 of these bookmarks waiting to be given out to people. Now, I'm not going to tell you how you can get them yet. You're going to have to tune in next episode to find out how you can buy one of these from where you are right now. But I will say that I will bring these with me to Macstock this summer. And so if you listen to the podcast, come say hi, and I will give you a Bookworm bookmark.
Nice. I did not know you got I saw you sent me the preliminary on these things, and 1,000. Holy buckets, Mike.
Yeah, I got this great big box. And as soon as I got it, I'm like, this maybe was a mistake. I open it up, and there's just bookmarks for days. But
wow.
Like I said, it was only a couple bucks more to get 1,000 as opposed to 150. So I'm like, go big or go home.
That's nuts. Well, now you're going to have to tune in next time to figure out how to get these. I know the answer to this.
Yeah, next episode is episode 50. So we've got something special planned. You're definitely going to want to catch that one.
Okay, so we got new podcast gear. We got Bookworm bookmarks coming down the pipeline.
Say that 5 times fast.
Bookworm bookmarks.
See, it's hard.
Blech. You got a couple other things here for follow-up outside of, fun toys and such.
Yep. So real follow-up, I've got use and instead of but, and I've also got eliminate fixed opinion words and use personal words. These are both kind of aspirational action items that there's no way you're going to be able to hold me accountable to these, but I have done these.
Kind of typical for us, right?
Yeah, exactly. I do have some real ones for this time, quote unquote, real ones.
Right.
So, and then the other one was to invite people to tell their wins. This I haven't officially implemented. I will actually do this today, though, later on. So I think I mentioned in the last episode that I've got a discipleship group of guys at my church where I think this would be perfect. And I've forgotten the last couple times that we've met. Our meetings, we tend to go like wire to wire, trying to cram everything in anyways. But we have a little bit more time this afternoon, and it's fresh of mind. So I'm definitely going to implement this afternoon.
Okay.
And then you've got some, and I want to know right away, these are not in correct order. I want to know, what are your 5 brand words?
So you want me to start there? Okay.
Yep. This is follow up from like 2 episodes ago. So we got to get this one.
Or 3 maybe. I don't know. I did it. That's at least a step in the right direction, I suppose. This comes all the way back from, I'm going to have to look it up now. It is from doing the book Busy.
Yep.
So whatever episode Busy was, that would have been 46, it looks like. So episode 46. So this being 49, I'm now, 3 episodes behind on this one?
But at least you got it done.
I got her done. All right, so 5 brand words. And just as a refresher, like the purpose of this was to change your brand from one of exhaustion and, being overworked and constantly hustling from one thing to the next and just being, overwhelmed. So changing away from that and then using these as a way to, guide your conversations and what it is that you do day to day. So 5 brand words. Number 1, authentic. There was a whole list of these in the book. I didn't necessarily follow them to the letter, but I picked a couple of my own. But one of those was authentic, and I have kind of a push for this across a lot of the platforms and conversations that I have. It's like, I want to be very real with people. I don't like it when people sugarcoat things. I'm pretty particular with making sure or hunting down when people are trying to put one over on me, and I don't want to be that person. So I've tried for a long time to be very real with things, and I want that to continue to be something that comes out. So number 1 is authentic. Number 2, I feel like this one fits me pretty well. Entrepreneurial. I feel like I'm always looking for an angle to develop my business or a new business in some way. Like, I'm always trying to build something that could be helpful to other people and that would potentially drive a future income. Doesn't have to be right away, but could be in the future. So I feel like I'm always trying to build or develop something in some way. So that would be number 2. Number 3, I deviated a little bit from the list and just wrote down white space. And this is something that, if you remember, I don't remember if it was 2 episodes ago now, maybe last episode, about developing white space in our family. That has become something that's really important to me, is making sure that we have the space to just go play as a family and not necessarily just hustling quite a bit. So this maybe coincides a little bit with the book Busy, or directly contradicts the cultural norm there. But we really like to have those buffer zones. And although that kind of started with our family, I've been seeing that start to morph into, the timelines that I put together for clients on development projects. It can come in on the amount of time I allocate towards certain tasks in a day. Like, how much time am I going to spend on email? Or, even, I'm going to go run a gig for a local band, run sound for them. Like, okay, well, I'm going to give myself an extra amount of time before and after that just to show up early and just have conversations and have some fun. So, creating those buffer zones and that white space between things, I've found to be something that I really see as important and want to help other people to develop as well. So authentic, entrepreneurial, white space. Number 4 is innovative, which can kind of go with entrepreneurial, but I like to be, or try to find ways to think outside the box and find a different angle on, or a different way of doing something that is already being done, which would lead me into number 5 of being a problem solver. So I can see how there's a pretty strong theme here of trying to be someone who's very real and finding something new in that. So that comes out in being innovative, trying to find a new way to do things, but also I just really love helping people solve their problems. Maybe that's why I do the development thing, because someone brings a problem with their website or, you name it, and it is now my goal to try to meet that and solve that problem in some way. So there you have it, Mike. Authentic, entrepreneurial, white space, innovative, problem solver. There you go.
Nice. I will send every website problem I have over to you now, so you can solve them.
All right. I have 3 follow-up items. That was number 3 that Mike made me jump ahead to. So do I have to do them backwards then, if you made me start at the end?
No, you can pick whatever other ones you want. I just wanted to make sure you did that one.
I'm going to go backwards. All right. So number 2 is avoid arguments. I think I've been better about this.
No, you haven't.
I haven't?
I'm just kidding. Creating an argument right now.
See, I even responded with a question. No, this comes from our last book of How to Win Friends and Influence People, of trying not to prove that I'm right, especially with my clients. So trying to, guide them instead of saying, no, this is wrong. And I don't feel like I've done a lot of arguments in the past, but it is a thing that I wouldn't say has never happened. So is it actually done? I don't know. I'm going to mark it off and say yes, but I haven't been having arguments as much lately.
There we go. Success.
Number 1 on my list, since I'm going backwards, is developing a checklist for client calls for right before I jump on a client call. I did do this. I have a checklist of things that I am going to do as far as, doing a little bit of research about the company, what are their websites, what kind of design and stuff is involved with their current process, and then looking over what they have sent me already, because they usually send me a series of what their problem is that they're trying to solve in some way, what their idea is, and trying to go through some of that. I've been using it for a few calls already, and it has sped them up significantly, which I was not expecting. I was more just trying to use that as a way to understand their company quicker. And I have found that if I start a call, Mike, and just say, I was doing some research about your site and how you guys do things, and this is my view on that as it pertains to your idea here. For whatever reason, saying that and being able to be very genuine in that, because I did do that, they trust me quicker on what's going on. They trust my opinion on things, and I get more of those projects, and they seem to go way smoother. Like, that's just been my experience so far.
Awesome.
That has had a much bigger impact than I was expecting. So if you do client work, I highly recommend this. Just saying.
Sweet. Go Joe.
Go follow up. Follow up, check. Which brings us to today's book, Peak by Anders Ericsson. This was a listener recommendation. I tried to figure out who recommended this and couldn't find it for whatever reason. Maybe I deleted the email, because this is back when we did recommendations via email. I could not find that. So, sorry, whoever recommended this, you're free to reach out to me and say, hey, that was me.
Whoever recommended this, definitely recommend another book. I like this one.
So, yes, Peak. Tagline on this is Secrets from the New Science of Expertise. Very in-depth book about the process of becoming an expert in your field. And take your pick on what field you would like to talk about. I'm guessing that there was some piece of that field discussed somewhere in this book. It was very comprehensive on covering a lot of different sectors.
Yeah, there was tons of stuff in this one. I put down some talking points just because there wasn't anything. When was this? Yesterday or today when I opened up the document?
You always fill this in. I never touch this.
Yeah. Well, I feel kind of bad because this one I was like, well, we should probably condense this down and skip certain sections. And I didn't feel like there was anything in here that we should skip because it's all so good.
Okay.
So I guess we'll just try to crank through all 9 of these as quick as we can. First one here is the power of purposeful practice. And this kind of sets the stage for everything that he's going to talk about. What's interesting here, though, is that he doesn't really get to the gold standard, that's section 4, till a little bit later. But he does talk about the usual approach that people take when they try to learn things. And he's got some stories in this first chapter which explain why those usual approaches don't really work. And then some purposeful practice examples of how people have used this to achieve some pretty crazy results. But like I said, he's kind of holding back a little bit because he's going to give you the formula a little bit later. But even right away at this beginning section of the book, he's got me hooked. He starts off with this story about a guy named Steve who randomly is trying to remember and memorize strings of numbers, random numbers. And when they start doing this experiment with this guy, he can only remember like 9 in a row. But he keeps doing it. He basically plateaus and he's frustrated with himself because he wants to get better. Then he breaks through and eventually 2 years later, he can remember 82 random characters in a row, which is nuts when you think about that. Like, I have trouble remembering a phone number, 7 characters. I honestly think like a lot of those security codes that you get from places for 2-factor authentication, they're never more than 6 characters because it seems like 6 is like the logical place where, yeah, people can remember that, and anything above that, like there's a good chance they're going to get it wrong. So 82 characters. What?
Yep.
And this is a completely, I don't want to say completely useless, but kind of like you're not gonna make a living with this type of skill probably. But it just shows you the kind of thing that people kind of struggle with a little bit in their everyday life. It's not enough to really think like, oh, I should really develop this skill and fix this problem that I have. But everybody can relate to this. Like they've all experienced that where it's like, oh yeah, just tell me the number. And then I can't remember it. So it just shows you like, you have trouble with this one little thing, but here's an example of a guy who's gone so much beyond that, and it's because he's not taking this usual approach to memorizing these things. He's applying this whole idea of purposeful practice to get better.
Yeah, I really liked this section just because it explained that you don't have limits, and we'll get into this in the next one, but like we tend to think there are certain limits to what the human brain can accomplish. And this is a good example of that because we typically didn't really think about how many numbers you could hold in your memory before repeating them. I feel like I personally have been better at the whole number memorization thing than most. Like I have a handful of numbers in my head that are non-typical, like driver's license numbers and more social security numbers than I probably should have in my brain, like all of my kids, my wife and mine. And I've even had cases where there's a couple of social security numbers in my head because someone rattled it off just to prove that I couldn't remember it. And I did. So I have a few numbers in my head and just because of that, but that's more long-term, not even like this whole test was for short-term memory.
Yep.
And and they go on to explain later on in the book that even, he gets to the point where he's recalling 82 numbers or whatever it was, 80 something. And since that time, that number has then grown to over 300. That, the records continue to be broken on how far people can go with that. That just kind of blows my mind. Like, to your point, why? Like, what am I supposed to do with this?
Yeah.
Like, it's a cool trick. It's a fun party trick of sorts, but I don't really see the usefulness in that. But it did show a good point in that if you are smart with the way that you practice, which this is what I took as the point here is if you're smart with the way that you practice, then you can improve on any goal or task that you set yourself to.
Exactly. So the usual approach, and he has another person in this section, Renee, who's not able to memorize that much. They repeated the same experiment, and she plateaued a long time before Steve did. And they're like, well, why is that? The usual approach is to get to a quote-unquote acceptable level and then plateau because that's good enough. And at that point, additional traditional practice doesn't help you. You have to push yourself if you want to continue to get better. So a step up from that is this purposeful practice, which is different than what he calls naive practice, which is just doing something a bunch of times. And I think this is the thing that's really important, is we can probably all identify situations in our lives where we've applied this naive practice, we've hit a plateau, we're like, oh, that's as far as I can go. Maybe somebody can go further, but that's it for me. And really his point is like, no, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Like there's a whole lot more ground to take in this particular area if you really want to, but you have to approach it the right way. And the thing that Steve used to help him remember this stuff, and this is really the thing that was interesting to me in this section, is like your short-term memory is limited. You've only got so much RAM in your biological computer. But you can create these mnemonics or these mental modes to help you transfer that into long-term memory, and then that exponentially increases what you're able to get done. And the purposeful practice is the thing that allows you to recognize these patterns which are there. So a lot of it is like awareness. It's just like seeing the stuff for what it really is, as opposed to just a bunch of random numbers.
Yeah, I think this moves us into the second here of harnessing adaptability, because so much of what we've known historically is that you're born with an innate talent and you can only be as good as what you're born with. Like that has been we know now, a myth for a long time. And the second section, he really gets into some of the neuroscience behind some of this, with homeostasis and plasticity of the brain, and how you can, if you focus on a certain area, continue to get better at it. I believe this is a section where he brought up the London taxis, taxi drivers, and how certain parts of their physical brain are larger than the normal human being. And
the hippocampus.
That whole section was like the spatial recognition part of the brain. And number one, London taxi drivers, holy buckets, you have to remember a lot.
Yep.
Like that was intense whenever he was explaining some of the details that those particular drivers have to remember in the tests that they go through to even get their license. That was just bonkers to me. But I thought it showed a really cool aspect of how the brain can evolve and adjust to being deliberately practiced on a certain area. So I thought it was kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, necessity is the mother of invention, right? Like, if you're going to be a taxi driver in London, you have to learn this stuff. So your brain adapts so that you can learn this stuff.
Right.
On page 47, he says, the reason that most people don't possess these extraordinary physical capabilities isn't because they don't have the capacity for them, but rather because they are satisfied to live in the comfortable rut of homeostasis and never do the work that is required to get out of it. They live in the world of good enough. And now this whole idea of homeostasis, he does a good job of explaining this. I had no idea what this was before I read the book, but I feel like I kind of understand it now.
Okay.
So I'm going to talk about it like an expert on a podcast. No, just kidding.
Perfect.
But homeostasis is the tendency of a system to act in a way that maintains its own stability. So how does that apply to your brain changing or your body changing? Well, your body is going to try to maintain a status quo. And if you push your body, your muscles and your cells are forced to change and find a new comfort zone. This is what exercise does. Okay, so when your body is pushed to the point where homeostasis can no longer be maintained, the body has to respond with changes which are intended to reestablish that homeostasis, that new normal. And this works in your brain too, because your brain, and it, like in your body, you would use this to develop muscle, for example. But your brain requires these networks and develops new neurons, which creates new connections. And it produces myelin, which is something that we learned about in Deep Work by Cal Newport, I believe it was. Myelin is the substance around your nerve cells that allows them to fire faster and cleaner. And in this book, he mentions that it allows them to fire up to 10 times faster. So it's the stuff that allows your brain to work better, but then also it's building your brain. That's just why the hippocampus and the London taxi drivers grew. And this is a really cool idea because it means that, like, London taxi drivers, this wasn't when they were 6, 10, 12 years old. I mean, they're grown adults and they're still able to change their state. Now, a lot of the research behind the brain that I've heard in the past is like, by the time you're 12, the majority of this is developed or whatever. And so I think if you read those stats, you can be like, oh, well, I kind of missed my chance to develop my brain to the maximum capacity for the rest of my life. And really, this section is saying that no, like, your brain is always changing, your body is always changing. And so if you apply this idea of purposeful practice, you can make it change in the way that you want and develop the skills that you want to have.
As long as you do it the right way. That was the takeaway I had from a lot of this and it didn't even translate into an action item for real, I don't think. You know, for me, action items were tough to come by in this particular book, but seeing how there's not really a timeline that could lead you to the point where you can't get better. Like, there are obviously some things that, like, I will never be a better swimmer than Michael Phelps. Guaranteed. I do not have the physical makeup for that. So he has a definite edge from a physical stance than I do. So I will never keep up with him. So,
well, we'll get into that in a little bit, but I would argue against that because what matters is the approach that you take. So just the fact that Michael Phelps was born with the DNA that he has means nothing if he's not applying the same purposeful practice that you are. Now, I know a little bit about Michael Phelps and his regimen, so yeah, there's no way you're going to catch him because
exactly.
the guy's a disciplined machine. Like, he's got this purposeful practice down to a science. So given where he is now, where you are now, if you both apply this, like, you'll never catch him. But he uses examples, even in the physical arena of sports, of people who, like, if you're 5 foot tall, it's going to be hard for you to make it to the NBA. But that doesn't mean you can't. Like, if you apply purposeful practice, you literally can achieve any goal that you want, which is really exciting.
Like Allen Iverson, good luck. Super short dude, but he'll kill you on the floor. So
yeah, exactly. One other thing I want to call out here is the whole section about the musicians. He talks a lot about musicians and in particular violinists, which I liked because I grew up playing violin.
You're not biased on this at all, are you?
No, not at all. Well, it resonated with me because he talks about the changes that happen as you practice the violin in particular. And I grew up learning the Suzuki method, which is a lot about memorization. I remember when I was 12 years old, I had like 8 volumes of music memorized. I could play like Vivaldi's Four Seasons from memory. And I would do that in front of people and they'd just be like, how can you do that? And I recognize now after reading this book that, like, I wasn't special. Like I just applied this principle of purposeful practice. I had a good teacher who taught me these fundamentals, and I just did them every day.
Right.
And that purposeful practice is what allowed me to memorize all this stuff and develop the musical ear that I now have. And I'm grateful that my parents had me stick with that when I was younger. I mean, there's all sorts of people who are like, oh, I wish I would have stayed playing piano or whatever. But really, it also doesn't matter when you start. Like it is easier when you start, because I started when I was 5 years old. And I took lessons up until the time I was 18, and I still play today. Like the stuff that was instilled in me from 5 to 18 is carrying over through the rest of my life. That's a good foundation that I had. But just because you don't have that foundation doesn't mean you can't do this. That's the thing about this book that's really exciting to me, is like, it doesn't matter where you start, whether you're 15 or 55, just where are you going to go right now? Like, what are you going to do right now going forward that's going to produce the results that you want? Because you're in control. Like, you're the captain of your own ship. All you have to do is apply this purposeful practice. And whenever you hit that plateau or that ceiling, because you're going to hit it at some point, recognize that that's not the end of the line. That's just an obstacle for you to overcome. But the musician's part here, I really like this because that's a great example of learning to develop this purposeful practice on a regular basis. If you were to discipline yourself, regardless of your age, to learn how to play an instrument, you're practicing purposeful practice every day. And I think that skill, that purposeful practice, like that deep work that Cal Newport would talk about, that translates to just about any other area. So if you read this book and you really like the principle behind it, like apply it to whatever domain you want, but just do it over and over and over again. And then as you do that, as we're talking about in this particular chapter, homeostasis, the plasticity of the brain, like your body is going to adapt to develop the capacity for the thing that you want to do.
Which brings us to part 3 of mental representations, because I think that's exactly what's going on. Like, this is something I've referred to quite a bit as connecting the dots. You know, mental representations are basically little tiny pieces that you create and become so ingrained in the way that you do things that they then become building blocks to develop even more mental representations or connect even more dots. And there are a lot of ways that you can think through this, but, you know, coming from my world of development, like I have a very large number of these mental representations around ways to put code blocks together. Like it doesn't necessarily come down to syntax on how do you actually write the code anymore for me, because I've done that so much that it's not a thing that I have to think through. I start thinking through logistics on how data transfers. Now, that might be over the top of your head for some people, but essentially what it is you're memorizing bits over time that then help develop into bigger bits. The classic example here is learning to read. Like you learn letters, and letters become your mental representations that then develop into another mental representation of a word. And then that builds into a sentence, and then sentences into paragraphs, and then, you know, entire essays, books, and then it continues to develop beyond that. But each step of that process is a mental representation. And, you know, the point in the book ends up being that if you want to improve on an area, then you need to determine what these mental representations are that you need to develop and then continue to build on top of them. And that is the mechanical process that you go through to build into your practice routines that continue to push you towards that expert level of experience in a certain realm.
Yeah, mental representations are basically patterns that help you to remember things. And I like the code example. Another example would be scales for a musician.
Yeah.
Another example would be chess openings. This is where he talked a lot about chess.
He's kind of obsessed with chess.
Yeah, he is. And I like that, though, because I think that that's a great example. I mean, I grew up playing chess. I went to tournaments and stuff. I totally understand what he's talking about, where he mentions that there's all these different patterns in chess, and specifically there's different openings in chess. So there's only a certain number of good moves you can make at the beginning. And there's whole books written which are just filled with these openings where if you open with this, then you counter with this. And so good chess players, the first part of the game is automatic. They just choose the opening that they're going to use. The person chooses the response they're going to use. And like the first 10 moves, like there's no thought that's required for the most part. And what's really interesting is when you play somebody who's really good at chess and they open with a particular opening and you respond with something that's completely crazy, like it breaks their brain. they like look at you and like they just have to stop. Like these guys, maybe they've played thousands of hours of chess and they're really, really good and they can figure out anything. And then you just do something that's out of the ordinary and it's like, whoa, like,
what are you doing?
Put on the brakes. Let's figure out what's going on here. Yeah, because you've broken the mental model. You've broken the pattern, and then they have to figure it out. So these patterns, what they do is they allow you to accurately size up the situation quickly and identify strengths and weaknesses, which is what's happening in the game of chess when you do these openings. And it also gives you the ability to zero in on individual details and pieces, which is what you force people to do when you do something out of the ordinary. It's like, okay, so now I really have to figure out what's going on here. And then you have to look at like each individual piece on the board. And again, there's different patterns that are applied to this. So, like if your king is castled on the right side of the board and you've got certain pieces in front of it, like it's fairly well protected. You don't need to worry about whether that pawn is in the right place. But it is interesting how, like, when you watch somebody playing a game of chess, especially at a high level, you can kind of see like the efficiency that's happening there is pretty crazy, because at any time when they make a move, it's impossible for them to fully consider every single piece on the chessboard. They have to rely on these patterns, which is why computers can sometimes beat the best players in the world, because they can analyze all the patterns at the same time. But also, like, the ability to think outside the box and go around the patterns is pretty cool too. One of the things that they mention in here is that you need to have options. They give another example with the mental representations with the doctors, where they assimilate the facts about the patient, then they recall the relevant medical knowledge, and they use the facts and the knowledge to identify possible diagnoses and choose the right one. But a common mistake that he mentioned that a lot of doctors make is that they fail to generate multiple options. It's that confirmation bias that we read about in whatever book that was. Man, so many books. The Art of Thinking Clearly, that's what it was.
Rob DeBelly, I think.
Yeah. That was really interesting to me too, is like, so these mental models, mental representations, yes, they do make it easy to accurately identify what's going on in all of these different informations. But in the case of a doctor, when it's life and death, you have to be able to break away from those mental models and not get sucked into, well, this is what's going on here. Like, you really need to understand all the details.
A lot of interesting things with patterns, I think. And, and he talks about chess a lot in the book, and I don't see that as a bad thing. I played chess quite a bit in elementary and high school, so I have a thing for chess as well. I haven't played it in recent years just because I don't really know a lot of people that play it. So, yes, I'm with you on the whole chess thing. I totally get it. And I like that he talked about it quite a bit. Chess is one of those games where it's very quantifiable as far as, how good you are and obviously who wins or not.
Yep.
But, it's an interesting game. So I'm fascinated by it. But you have another point here under mental representations for two forms of writing.
I thought this was cool because I write a lot. And so this showed me there's two ways that I can practice this on a regular basis. So the two forms of writing that he mentioned, I'll do these out of order, but the first one that I want to stay away from is knowledge telling. That's the beginner way. Knowledge telling is just like spitting out a bunch of facts, and that doesn't really tell a compelling narrative, I feel. The other way is to plan it, and this is what he calls the expert way. And on page 76, he talks about to write well, develop a mental representation ahead of time to guide your efforts. Then monitor and evaluate your efforts and be ready to modify that representation as necessary. So what does this look like? It means that when I sit down to write, I'm thinking about who I'm writing to and what the goal of the thing that I'm going to be writing is. I'm not just sitting down and whatever comes to mind, like I'm putting words on the page. And maybe you could get some benefit from that, but I do think that as a content creator on the interwebs, that there's a lot more value to taking this approach. I feel like you're going to hit the mark a lot better if you plan your approach to writing.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I mean, I do a fair amount of writing. I spend more time writing emails than anything, and that's fine, but email has its own, like, if you think it through ahead of time instead of just transferring information, even that can be in the same sector as what you're talking about, but it's not near as long, and it doesn't have to be as thought through because it's not as comprehensive, if you will. So I think I do a fair amount of writing yet for a few projects, but I don't know that it's nearly, like, it's not even anywhere close to what you do, Mike, at all. So I definitely like the latter of the two, for sure, but I don't know that this is a thing that I would see as a big point that I need to take.
Fair enough. I just really like this idea because Tan has been talking about this at Agent Efficiency with these stories, and we've been putting these in our acceptance criteria of like the blog posts that we write and the podcasts that we record, is thinking through ahead of time, like, okay, someone is going to give us their time to read this thing or listen to this thing. What can they get from this? Like, how are we delivering value to them? And if you don't think about that, there's a chance that you may not deliver value.
Right.
That's kind of scary to me. I take that responsibility, I guess, seriously. And I know that people tune in because it's entertaining, but I don't want to waste anybody's time. And ultimately, like, I don't want to waste my time either. Like, why write something that isn't going to help anybody and nobody reads?
Right. I think whenever I go to share things like this is where that innovative piece comes in with those brand words. Because like I'm pretty particular with, if I'm going to write an article or talk about something that involves discourse, with that, I'm going to be very particular about making sure that if I'm going to share how to do something, it's something I have not seen talked about yet. And it's a new way of doing things that hasn't been conveyed. And I deal with it enough that I'm usually pretty good about finding those things. Same thing in like the productivity space. If I'm going to share something, like I've gotten to where I want to make sure that this is a new way, like it's a new workflow I've written, or it's a different way of using the calendar or whatever it is, to try to help people find their own ways of using things instead of, here's the best way to manage your email. Like I have some pretty strong opinions on how that stuff should be shared or what I should be sharing. So I'm pretty particular with trying to make sure it's new. So whenever I'm thinking about, how I'm conveying that, it's usually some of it's knowledge transfer. So maybe some of that's the former, but I try to make sure I'm explaining the whys behind it so that it can resonate with people. But I don't do it a lot, but when I do, that's the path I try to take. I don't know if that is what you're talking about, Mike. It sounds like you're maybe coming at it from the sense of, this is a thing I want to convey and this is the best way to do it so that it actually helps someone. It doesn't necessarily have to be a completely new way to do things. It just has to have some value in itself. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm making those two distinctions very clearly.
Yeah, so you're talking about things that could be under the second form of writing that I'm describing here, but I don't think it necessarily has to be. So one important distinction I think to make here is that, like, a lot of the stuff that I write about, it's not new. It's new to me.
Right.
But if I search the internet for something, I'll find somebody else who said something similar. And I used to do that. I used to get discouraged by that and be like, oh man, I can't come up with anything. I'm not creative. And what I've learned is that all you can do is share what you know. Sean McCabe talks about teach everything that you know. And I think maybe he picked that up from Nathan Barry at one point.
I was going to say that's a Barryism there.
Yeah. And the real point is, like, you don't have to be an expert in something before you can help somebody. There are always going to be people who are not at the level that you are. So you don't have a responsibility to try to teach an expert, hey, this is the way that I think you should be doing this. Like, somebody above you, that's not gonna provide any value, and you're just gonna look like an idiot. But if you find somebody who's struggling with email and you say, hey, this is what has worked for me, maybe you want to try this, and you present it in the right way because you've read How to Win Friends and Influence People, then that's absolutely something that you should do. Like, don't keep stuff in just because somebody else wrote about something. But what I want to do is, when I sit down to write, like, have a goal. What is the outcome I want to achieve? I don't want to just write to write. I've done that, and it produced some stuff, but I feel if I had this revelation earlier, it would have significantly shortened the process of writing the book if I had an idea of where I wanted to end up when I had started to show up and write every day. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay, and so I think that planning that ahead of time, having a vision for where you want to go, and this applies to anything in life, not just writing. Like, if you know where you want your family to end up, if you know where you want your career to end up, then you can do the things that are going to get you there.
And a lot of this, this is maybe a recurring theme in the book of think about the thing that you need to do and then go do it. Like,
Yep.
what is the best way to get better at learning a larger vocabulary? Well, what are the steps you should go through to learn words and learn how to use them correctly? Well, do that.
We tell my kids all the time, stop, think about what you're going to do. Okay, now
Now go do it. Yep.
Like, why shouldn't I do the same thing?
Right. Which, there's your perfect segue to part 4, the gold standard of deliberate practice. Like, that's what we're talking about.
Yep. So you just gave away what the gold standard was, because earlier we talked about the usual approach and then purposeful practice, but the gold standard is, like you said, deliberate practice.
Right. And, this is, if I have a qualm with the book, it's that he repeats the same theme multiple times over and over again, just in different ways. With this particular piece, like, this is the core of it, in that thinking through what it is that you need to do to hone in on a nuanced piece of your trade, or to develop a skill at a more fine level. Decide what it is that you need to do and do it. Like, there you go, deliberate practice.
First of all, let me just run through real quickly the 7 characteristics of deliberate practice that he has in here. And there's lots of lists in this chapter. We're not going to go through all the lists. But this one, I think, is going to help people understand the difference between deliberate practice and purposeful practice. So, characteristics of deliberate practice. Number 1, develop skills that other people have already figured out how to do and for which effective training techniques have been established. Number 2, takes place outside of one's comfort zone and requires a student to constantly try things that are just beyond his or her current abilities. So failure here is not a bad thing. Number 3, involves well-defined specific goals and often involves improving some aspect of the target performance. Number 4, requires a person's full attention and conscious actions. Sounds a lot like deep work to me. Number 5, involves feedback and modifications of efforts in response to feedback. Number 6, both produces and depends on effective mental representations. So this is interesting because it means that in order to apply deliberate practice, you have to have these mental representations, but the more you do deliberate practice, the more mental representations you develop. So it gets easier and easier to do this. Number 7 nearly always involves building or modifying previously acquired skills by focusing on particular aspects of those skills and working to improve them specifically. So that's a lot there. There's another section in here where it kind of compares them side by side. So deliberate practice requires a field that's reasonably well developed, and it requires a teacher who can provide practice activities designed to help a student improve his or her performance. That teacher could be an actual person, it could be a YouTube video, it could be a blog post, it could be a podcast. But the difference here is that purposeful practice is pushing oneself hard to improve. Deliberate practice is purposeful and informed. So deliberate practice is purposeful practice that knows where it is going and how to get there. It's a very important difference.
And he mentions Malcolm Gladwell in this whole process, because Malcolm Gladwell, I think, is the one that really, I guess, popularized a lot of this, I think.
Yep.
With the 10,000 hour rule to become an expert. We could dive into this a little bit more, but I think it's interesting that, this is a topic that a lot of people have referred to, of what does it take to become an expert in a field. And they refer to, 10,000 hours of doing something or practicing something to get to that point. But the distinction that you just made is the key to that whole process that a lot of people miss out on. It's like, well, you have to know what it is you're doing and why, and specifically seeking out ways to find the areas that you're lacking and do something about it. Like that's a key distinction that I feel like Malcolm Gladwell didn't come out of his book. What was it? Outliers was the book. And that didn't really come out in that. At least people didn't catch it. If he goes through it and he spells it out, I've not read the book, disclaimer there. So if he spells it out, it didn't make it into public translation in the media of any kind. So I was a little bit bummed about that.
Yeah, I also have not read Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. So when Anders Ericsson kind of badmouths Malcolm Gladwell a little bit, kind of picks on his research. Like, for example, he mentions that Malcolm Gladwell claimed all of the violinists that he studied at age 20 had put in the 10,000 hours, but only half of them did.
Yeah.
So like right away, he's destroying his credibility.
Yep.
And my note in the the document we're working off here is Malcolm Gladwell. What a chump. But again, I have no idea. I haven't read the book, so I really can't speak to it. But I do think that Anders Ericsson is right. The point he makes is that there is no distinction between that practice and that deliberate practice, which I do totally agree with. Again, in this section, they talk about the musicians and the violinists, and they talk about how there are no prodigies, there are no shortcuts. To become an expert on the violin requires several thousand hours of practice. And the biggest predictor of success is how many hours you put into it. So in that case, Malcolm Gladwell's point about 10,000 hours to become an expert on the surface level, it's absolutely true. But if you dig into it on an individual basis, how you practice is more important than whether you practice in terms of becoming like the very elite of whatever field you want to be in.
So the key here is deliberate practice. It's the way to go. It's the gold standard. Question there, though, Mike, is how do you actually do that? Thankfully, the next section is principles of deliberate practice on the job, and he kind of starts to delve into, in these next few sections, like how do you go about putting this into place, and what are the, like, how do we actually do this when you're going to work or, you know, when you're at home? Like, these are some places where he starts to dive into that. But you have a point here, 3 myths. I don't recall this. What are the 3 myths?
Yeah, and actually, before we get there, because this is where he started to lose me in this book, honestly.
Okay.
But he has a blueprint in the gold standard, which I just want to call out real quick before we get into the principles of deliberate practice on the job. He says that the blueprint for getting better in any pursuit is to get as close as deliberate practice as you can. And then he gives 3 steps. Identify the expert performers, figure out what they do that makes them so good. And then number 3, come up with training techniques that allow you to do it too. And I think that approach you could apply to any specific area. Like you said, the next section, he gets into how do you apply this in these different arenas. And this I thought was kind of the weakest section of the book because I really liked the principles. And I was thinking, my mind was racing as I was reading this first part of the book, like, oh, I could apply this here. I could apply it there. I could play more chess. That's going to help me, you know?
Yeah.
And now he's like, okay, this is how you practically do it. And I'm like, well, maybe. But the 3 myths that he talks about here, this is regarding the improvement only being possible if participants abandon the business as usual practices and they reject these 3 myths, which are typically found on the job. Okay, so number 1, your abilities are limited by your genetically prescribed characteristics. Myth number 2, if you do something long enough, you're bound to get better at it. Myth number 3, all it takes to improve is effort. You can try really hard, you can do something a lot, and usually if you don't see any progress at that point, you fall into that first myth and you say, well, I guess I just wasn't made to do this. Okay, and his point is that, well, any one of those things could have been contributing to the fact that you failed at this thing, but what's required is not that you give up, but that you think about it differently and you figure out how to solve this thing. I do have another thing here in this section where he talks about focusing on one particular skill. I really like this part because this is exactly what Toastmasters does. On page 122, he talks about Art Turok, I believe, telling presenters to focus on one skill. And Toastmasters, what they do is, yeah, you have to go through and you give 10 speeches, but there's a emphasis on each individual speech. Like the first one is the icebreaker. All you're focusing on is getting up in front of people for the first time and telling your story, something that you're familiar with. The next one, I don't have these in front of me, but the next one that gives you like a couple basic points on like, if you're going to structure a speech, this is what it should look like. And then there's one later where you're focusing on your body language and all these sorts of things. There's advanced curriculum, which like there's a whole book on just how to tell better stories, things like that. And I think like that approach, whether you're trying to get into public speaking or you're trying to become a better, you want to learn more scales on the guitar, the piano, whatever, you want to lower your golf handicap, whatever it is, like you can apply this approach and just focus on one little aspect of it. Earlier in the book, he talks about how like trying to improve a general skill like memorization isn't really going to work. You have to improve one specific thing. I also wanted to ask you regarding this section, because he talks about video, I believe, and I think there's a very important difference between YouTube videos, which is something that you would watch and you would acquire knowledge, versus something like video modeling, where you see the activity and then you translate it. Does that make sense?
One side of it being like a video that explains to you how something operates. and the second being an explanation of how to accomplish a task that you can then translate and do yourself.
Yeah, so like backing up a little bit, in this section he talks about what you're able to do, not what you know, is what's really important. And traditional business training typically focuses on knowledge at the expense of skills. He talks about passive learning, like lectures, that don't improve the care that patients receive from doctors. Okay, and that's what got me thinking about these YouTube videos, because I think that that's a form of passive learning a lot of times. You sit down and you watch a YouTube video and you have no goal of actually learning how to do one specific thing and applying it. Now, sometimes you do. You're trying to figure out how to change the oil on your specific make of car. Like, you can go on YouTube and you can find that video and it'll show you exactly what to do. Like, that's a little bit different because then you're translating that into action. But I think that a lot of our consumption-based society is focusing on this knowledge, and it's kind of scary. One, it's annoying because you get people who watch the video made by a YouTube guy who has no basis for anything that he believes, but he's throwing something up on the internet, and then all of a sudden they're the expert on whatever topic.
Yeah.
That's annoying. But also, like, if you just get in that consumption mode for the sake of consuming, you're getting away from deliberate practice and all of the stuff that we talked about earlier, where as you practice deliberate practice and you develop these mental representations and it makes it easier to develop more mental representations, I think the opposite of that is true, where if you sit down in front of the TV and you become mindless, like the easier it is to be mindless whenever you sit down to watch something. But what's interesting here is that it doesn't have to be that way. The video medium is not the bad guy here. It's your approach when you sit down to watch it, because there's this very powerful principle of video modeling. And just to give an example, this isn't from the book, but there was a study done, depending on where you look, it says University of Chicago or someplace in Australia. But the basis of it is that they took basketball players and they split them into 3 groups. The first group practiced shooting free throws for an hour every day for 30 days. They improved by 24%. The second group did not touch a basketball, but they practiced mental rehearsal and visualization, which is exactly what video modeling does. You picture yourself doing the activity the correct way. You're applying deliberate practice specifically to visualization and how you're going to do this. Even though they never touched a basketball for those 30 days, they improved by 23%. It's virtually the same thing, which is crazy when you think about it. But this is also the thing that makes Michael Phelps, we talked about him earlier, so successful. He's got a thing where he gets up on the platform and his coach yells, "Put in the videotape," and he's playing through in his head the race that he's about to swim. One of my favorite stories of him is, I forget which Olympics it was, but it was the Beijing Olympics. He was doing the 100-meter butterfly final or something like that. His goggles broke as soon as he jumped into the water, so he was swimming blind. But he had practiced this in his head so often that he knew exactly where everything was. He wasn't rattled. And that was the one where, if you remember, he stretched out at the end. He didn't take another stroke. The other guy did, and he won by like 1/100th of a second.
Great.
And they asked him afterwards, like, what did it feel like to swim blind? And he's like, it felt exactly like I imagined it would. So you can use video like this to apply deliberate practice in any area. In that particular scenario, no, he's an athlete, so he's applying it to his job. But you can apply it to your job too, whether you're working in a factory cranking out widgets or learning to develop your writing skills, podcasting, whatever, by just thinking through ahead of time, like, what is this going to look like?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to the original point here of focusing on one skill, because this is the point at which I started to really struggle with this book, because I felt like this is where he calls out deliberate practice and explains how that's different than purposeful practice, which to me was borderline splitting hairs to some degree. Like, okay, sure, I get it. I understand what he's saying. But then he spells out focusing on one skill, and I feel like he starts to repeat that throughout the rest of this. So this is where I felt like there was a turning point in the book, and I started to struggle with it, because then it starts to feel like a repetitive, find the point where you're weak, figure out how to work on it, and work on it. And he continues to repeat that story in different ways throughout the rest of it. Maybe that's just my perception of it, but that was kind of my take on it. I don't know. Did you get this feeling at all? I mean, you said this was where you kind of got lost.
A little bit. I do think that the difference between deliberate practice and purposeful practice is important, and I can see how this plays out, though, in the next section, when he's talking about the plateaus.
Okay.
So we can come back here, if you had something else to say regarding this section. But
no, go on, because I think it'll continue to come out.
Okay, yeah, because this directly applies to what you just said. Page 162, he says, when you first start learning something new, it is normal to see rapid or at least steady improvement. And when that improvement stops, it's natural to believe you've hit some sort of impassable limit. So you stop trying to move forward. You settle down to life on that plateau. This is the major reason that people in every area stop improving. I think that when you reach that plateau, you really have to drill down on one specific skill. So maybe let's just use golf as an example, because I used to golf. I don't golf a whole lot anymore, but I've taken a few lessons in golf, and most people, when they have a lesson, they're like, I want to fix my slice. I want to do whatever, and the pro will tell them, like, there may be 6 different things that they should change, but you can't have somebody change all of those things at once. So they'll have them do like the simplest change they can implement. Like, okay, we're going to just change your grip a little bit. Now get used to this. And then they come back and they make another little change, another little change. They're all like micro improvements of the bigger issue of the fact that every time I hit a drive, it slices off to the right. And so I think you can apply that approach to any time that you would hit one of these plateaus. Is like, regardless of the skill, there's always going to be one specific thing that you can drill down deeper to, and that may be the thing that breaks everything open. He talks about how the best way to move beyond a plateau is to challenge your brain or your body in a new way, and the best way to challenge it in a new way is to get as specific as possible. Niche down and identify what is the smallest thing I can do right now. What is the smallest thing I can improve right here that may just be the thing and the catalyst that makes everything else simpler. I've seen this myself in my my study of learning to play the violin. There have been plateaus where it's like, oh, I'm never going to learn how to do vibrato, or I'm never going to learn how to play in third position or whatever. There's definitely places like that where you feel discouraged and you're like, well, those guys can do it so easily. Like, what's the problem for me? And usually it's just figuring out like one specific thing. Like with vibrato, it was one specific movement on one specific finger, and that one thing, rather than trying to develop this vibrato, which sounded good all the time wherever I played it, just doing it this one finger in this one position. Once I got that, like everything else just kind of clicked into place. And so I think that you can apply this not just on the job, but we're talking chapter 6 now, principles of deliberate practice in everyday life. I think that this is really valuable if you really want to bust through things.
I feel like this is more of the same. It has a lot to do with, again, the recurring theme that I continue to see is, and maybe I'm just biased here because once you notice it, I continue to notice it. And I do see how there is a difference between, choosing to go practice and being intentional in doing your practice. And then turning that around and saying, I'm going to find the one thing that I need to work on right now and work on that one thing. And that being the difference that he's talking about. But regardless, and maybe this is just because I've always practiced this way, that whenever I'm working on something, I'm always looking for the place where I'm the weakest. And right now, maybe the example here is that I have a thing for running sound and audio. I'm not necessarily in a place where I would spend the money to solve some of the problems that I'm currently seeing in, say, my current, what you're hearing right now. Like I'm not necessarily in a place where I would do that, but I'm continually trying to see and notice the little nuances in certain frequencies of certain audio sources, and how do I tweak that to make it sound more clear and more real. Like that is a place where I've been spending probably the last 2 years continually trying to improve, and that goes for live performances, it goes for podcasting, anything to do that has to do with audio, video editing and grabbing the audio off of that, any of those things. I feel like I've been trying to get better at that. So I've been specifically finding places where I am subpar in my mind and then continuing to work on those. But I also don't see that as different than practice in general. But that might just be a factor, Mike, of me just always seeing practice in that way. It's like, okay, well, this is where I need to improve on XYZ. So go. That's the thing I need to work on. Like I feel like I've always done that. So the concept of just doing the thing without focusing on that seems a bit weird. So maybe that's my qualm here. Like that just seems odd to not do that.
Maybe. I do think that, and I don't think this is something that you do, but based off of what you just said, I think you could interpret that as focusing on your weaknesses and trying to develop those. And in specific areas, maybe, yeah, you want to do that. But generally, I would say that the things that you're no good at doing, unless you really have a reason to develop that skill, then be fine with not being good in those areas. And that's completely fine. Just choose something that you want to become excellent. In fact, he uses an example. I forget what chapter it's in, but this guy who's never played golf before, and he's just going to prove to himself that this deliberate practice works, and he's going to become a PGA Tour professional. Like he's going to be on the tour competing against Tiger Woods.
Yeah.
And at the time of the writing, he hadn't quite gotten there, but he had gotten pretty far. And I think that's cool. But again, like figure out what's important to you and then apply deliberate practice to it. That I think is an important idea. And maybe, like you said, you've applied this intentionally, unintentionally, whatever, for a while. I really got a lot out of this. Now, he is kind of repeating the same principles in these different sections. How it plays out in your job is the same way it's going to play out in everyday life. But there is some really important stuff in this particular section, though, which I think will resonate with people as they set personal goals as opposed to professional. So, for example, he talks about the New Year's resolution effect. And he talks about how, at first, it's easy. The experts are the ones who figure out how to keep going every day. And this is where he gets into this whole idea of willpower versus motivation. I think maybe this is in this section, and maybe he feels like he needs to call this out in everyday life, because when you're getting paid to do something and you have a manager who's holding you accountable for doing something, you've got the intrinsic motivation to do what you're supposed to do so you don't get fired. So maybe that's the justification for this particular section. But this whole idea of motivation versus willpower was really interesting to me. This probably was my favorite part of the book. Do you want to unpack this?
Yeah, I want to hear, why you felt like this was your favorite part, because I think I glossed over it.
Okay.
So it's fascinating to me that you loved this, and I am having a hard time recalling it at all.
Okay. So we read The Willpower Instinct, and it was one of my favorite books. Okay. I really liked that book. The point that he makes in this book is that willpower is a situation-specific attribute, and willpower and natural talent are both things that people tend to assign after the fact. I think this is absolutely true. So you can say, well, I joined the gym, I went every day for 3 weeks at the beginning of the year, but then I stopped going, I ran out of willpower. But how does that help you today? The fact that you didn't have willpower and you can see that after the fact, that's the thing that caused you to fail. How do you make sure that you don't fail next time? It's not like you've got a gauge in your car and you can see, my willpower is full. I should try to do this now. I mean, there's certain principles like eating your frog, doing the important things at the beginning of the day when you have the most willpower. Like those are general principles that I absolutely agree on. But I really like the idea here. He says the real secret to sticking with something is maintaining your motivation, because at any given instant, you can create motivation. It doesn't matter how tired I am. If my kids are running out into the street and they're about to get hit by a car, I've got motivation to go save their life. And that's a really extreme example, but I mean, you can think of your own scenarios where all of a sudden the situation dictates the fact that you have to do something and you don't even think about, I don't know if I can. Like you just do it. And that's because of motivation. There's 2 parts he calls out to maintaining motivation: the reasons to keep going or the reasons to stop. I love this idea. So anytime you find yourself having trouble sticking with something, and he talks about in here really what makes people successful is they've developed these habits. And then again, he talks about violinists in this section and how the successful violinists develop these habits and they start early in the day. So again, there is some general principles from the whole idea of willpower and starting early that we can apply here. But when it comes down to any moment, any given day, you find yourself with not enough motivation to do the thing that in your heart you want to do, you can either strengthen your reason to keep doing this thing, or you can decrease the reason to stop doing this thing. And again, if it's something you want to stop doing, you could apply this inversely, but this is specifically talking about deliberate practice. So how do we keep going with this deliberate practice? I think this is a revolutionary idea, and it's really cool because it puts you in control of the situation at any given moment. It does not matter what has happened up until this point today. There are things that you can do. You can renew your motivation to go to the gym no matter how dead tired you are.
But you have to have the willpower to, set that motivation.
Kind of, but I think that it's not necessarily true. Like you could have your willpower depleted, and if it's a life and death situation, all of a sudden you've got the motivation to act the right way.
Right.
So how do you trick yourself, hack yourself, whatever? How do you manufacture that motivation on demand? I believe that there are ways that you can do that. I think the simplest way to do it would be just to write down the list of the reasons why you want to keep doing something. And you look at that, you take it out, you read it out loud if you have to, like before you decide that, okay, I really am going to follow through on this commitment that I made to myself. A lot of times motivation can be like social pressure, like positive peer pressure, accountability. I don't want to have to go to my next podcast recording with Joe and tell him that I just was too lazy to follow through on my action items. Like that's an example of this motivation. We manufactured that motivation by starting this podcast.
Yep.
I had trouble following through with those things prior to having to tell you publicly that I failed. So I think that there's lots of things you can do that don't necessarily you don't have to start a podcast. You can do this on a micro level, but there are things that you can do every single day to manipulate your motivation, and that's a good thing.
So moral of the story is find a buddy and start a podcast. That's what I heard.
Well, it's one way you could do it, but there's lots of things that you could do to either strengthen your motivation to keep doing it or weaken your motivation to stop. I think just doing that for the first time can be really powerful. So if you've committed at the beginning of the year, you want to go to the gym, and then you find yourself struggling with the motivation to go at the end of the day when you've set aside the time to do so, take out a piece of paper if you've never done it and list all the pros and the cons if you go and if you don't go, and then figure out how to make the pros stronger and how to weaken the cons. So it just makes it inevitable. Like this is where packing your bag the night before and putting it by the door, like little things like that, that's a way of weakening the reasons to stop doing this, because you no longer have to think about getting everything ready to go. And yeah, I guess you could view that as you're not spending as much willpower, but I think like that's a lag measure, whereas a lead measure is the motivation, and that's the thing that you can influence at any given moment.
So I think I'm with you in that finding motivation that and the type of motivation that works for you. Take my business, for example. I have a pretty strong motivator to continue speccing projects and sending estimates and invoices, because by doing that, one, the business continues to work, but that's really not the main motivator there. The main is that I have people waiting for me, and I do not like it at all when people are waiting on me. Like, I just don't like that at all. I feel myself tensing up at the thought of people waiting on me to get information back to them. So when I have a handful of developers who are potentially waiting on me in order for them to do their job, like that's a pretty strong motivator for me.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if your willpower is high or low at that moment, because they're waiting for the thing. You're going to get it done.
Correct.
Deadlines do the same thing. If I have to get this thing done by a specific date, and you put it off until the last possible moment. At that moment, all of a sudden, you've got motivation. Well, why don't you create that motivation prior to that?
Yep.
Because you can do that. You can say, well, if I wait until a week from now to start working on this thing, that's going to make the weekend really crazy and stressful. I don't want that to happen. Okay, now I've got the motivation to start now.
So the next part here you go, listeners. Before we jump on the call, I typically read through this list of talking points that Mike has put up here, because his is usually way more extensive than what I would put up there, so I usually don't add to it. So there's my preface. But when I went through it, I saw this part 7, the road to extraordinary, and then Mike writes down page 205 and types in Mike's rant. Doesn't tell me what the rant's on, doesn't tell me what particular part of page 205 we're talking about. So this entire time, I've had this like down here, just kind of curious as to what is Mike's rant. He every once in a while has a good rant. Okay, I need to know what this is, Mike.
Okay, so section 7 is the road to extraordinary. And there's lots of good stuff here. And on page 205, he starts off with something that I agree with. He says, research on the most successful creative people in various fields finds that creativity goes hand in hand with the ability to work hard and maintain focus over long stretches of time. Exactly the ingredients of deliberate practice that produced their expert abilities in the first place. All right, so that's deep work. Great.
Yep.
Now, later on, he says that creativity will always retain a certain mystery because, by definition, it generates things that have not yet been seen or experienced. And I say, balderdash, Mr. Ericsson.
Okay.
And I feel very strongly about this because if I had this view, I would not be doing what I am doing right now. I've shared, I believe, on this podcast before how I viewed myself as a long time as not creative. I grew up playing violin. Like, I'm a fairly accomplished musician. I like to write songs. Okay, but I will write a song and I will see that the chord progression that I used or the melody line that I came up with, realize like I'm listening to the radio and I hear where I got that from. And I'd get so discouraged. And I'm like, oh man, I am just not creative. All I can do is rip off other people. Okay, and the tipping point for me where I finally got over that, and this thing like paralyzed me for years. For a long time, like I wrote nothing musically or words on the page because I was just like, I can't come up with anything new. I don't know what it is, but I'm just not creative. Other people have this thing, I do not. But the tipping point for me was when I read Austin Kleon's Steal Like an Artist, and he basically said that what you do when you create is that you connect all these dots, all these inputs, everything that you're bringing in your mental toolbox, your brain. When you create something, you're taking those dots, which are not original, and you are connecting them in ways that have not been connected before. Now, when you do that, you are not coming up with something that's mysterious. Like, that gave me a formula for this, and my entire career is based on the working of this formula. More good ideas in, more synthesis of good ideas out. And I can't tell you like how many people have written to me and encouraged me like, hey, you mentioned this, that really helped me. And it makes me upset when I think about the fact that like I held back on that for so long, and I see the positive impact that has when I just put stuff out there. And I feel like there's a lot of people who were in my shoes and they're just like, I have nothing to contribute. And I'm like, yes, you do. Like, we need what you have. Throw it out there because you don't know who it's going to help. You don't know who's on the other side of your faithfulness to this idea that you have in your heart. And the more that you hold back on it, like the more the world gets ripped off. I don't have the specific quote in front of me, but right now I'm thinking of, there's a quote in the Accidental Creative by Todd Henry, where he's talking to this guy, and this guy asks him something like, where do you think the most valuable land in the world is? And it's not real estate in Manhattan. It's not the oil fields in Saudi Arabia. The guy says it's the graveyard, because that's the place where all the unwritten books, unfounded businesses, like all the things that people said, I'll get to that later. And I would say like those people who are like, I'm going to get to that later, maybe it's not, doesn't manifest like that. Maybe it's just, well, I don't have the skill to do that quite yet. I need to get better. Okay. But the problem is you put it off till tomorrow and eventually you run out of tomorrows. And so this is just a very small part in this book, but I think it's really, really dangerous. And this is the thing that kept me stuck for a really long time. So I definitely disagree with him on this particular point. Creativity is not something mysterious. Yeah, it is. There is pieces to it that kind of seem like you don't really understand. I mean, we read The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. He talks about the resistance in like this spiritual realm, and it kind of makes it seem like something that you can't see, you can't touch. Like, it's kind of mysterious in that sense, but it doesn't have to be. Like, it doesn't have to be this thing that just is paralyzing you because you don't understand how it works and it's so much smarter than you and it's always working against you. Like, yeah, it's going to be there, but if you apply this principle of deliberate practice, you can do the thing that you're too scared to do right now.
One of the thoughts around this that I've had for a long time now is that if I'm going to write an article, if I'm going to create a video, if I am going to, take a project, I only really have to have the knowledge to share such that there is one person that doesn't know it yet, even if it's the same thing that's already in existence. And the more that you create in a given area, the more, this is right up this book's alley. The more that you work on that specific area and continue to write for it, take writing, for example, say a blog. The more blogs that I write, the better at writing them I get if I'm continually trying to improve my grammar, the vocabulary that I'm using, the comprehension around the topic itself. If I'm continually finding, the one thing to focus on and continuing to get better at it, then over time you start to develop more and more skills, and the number of people who don't know that level of skill continues to increase as your experience continues to increase. So, if you're ahead of one person in your writing, well, then you can help one person. But the more you write, you may get to the point where you're ahead of 10 people, and now you've got 10 people that you can write for. And as you get better, now you've got 1,000 or 10,000 or 1,000,000. Like, the more that you do it, the better you get, which means the people that you understand more than or have developed your skill more than continues to grow. You could probably correlate that to the process of building an audience online. Like, the more that you work at it, the more you develop and practice and develop your skills, the more creative dots that you're able to connect. And to some people, it may look like you're developing something brand new, when really you've just connected dots that have already been connected in one way or another. You're just expressing them differently, which means that it strikes different people in different ways. And eventually you may have a completely original idea, but I would say it's going to be likely a rare occurrence if you haven't already been developing the expertise over time and trying to connect a lot of dots historically. Like, it's going to take you a while to get to the point where you can start to connect dots that have never been connected before, or in ways that have never been done before. And it does take a lot of hours to get to that point. So, if you're one that says that you don't have something unique to share with the world, of course not, especially if you've never done it before. You're likely not to if you don't ever get started. If you feel like you have something unique to share to the world, go for it. But if you feel like you don't, how do you expect to get to that point if you don't start doing something about it? So there's your motivation. Get to work.
Yeah, and don't wait until you have the pedigree that you feel you need to share something. Just do it, because everybody that I know deals with imposter syndrome to some degree, and I deal with it a lot. I think about the fact that, like, I write and I podcast now on the interwebs, and this was not something I went to school for. This is something I literally just decided to start like 3 or 4 years ago. And I've applied deliberate practice, and I've gotten to this point, but still, like, I've got to fight those demons in my own head where it's like, who are you? Who do you think you are that you can say this or you can do this? Like, there's lots of other people out here that people would rather listen to than you. Like, that's what goes on in my head. And I just gotta say, shut up, I'm doing it. Iterate in public, as Sean McCabe says. And like I said, when I do that, I hear back from people. I get the feedback. That's kind of what he's talking about in here, is that you got to focus on the work that you're doing. You got to get the feedback, and then whatever you messed up, fix it. But if you never throw it out there, you're never going to get any feedback. And obviously you want to be careful who you listen to feedback from. Fortunately, I mean, especially in the Mac community, like, there's a lot of people who are really, really supportive. The productivity community is a lot like that too, where there's a couple people specifically who, like, commented on something that I did when I was first throwing stuff out there, and it was super, super scary. And they're like, hey, yeah, that's good. You should keep going. And I can't tell you, like, what that did to me and the motivation that gave me, and the confidence, like, hey, maybe this is something that I can do. Because for a long time, that's what I battled, was like, you don't have the ability to do this. And I think that there's a lot of people who maybe want to do something. They've got a dream to do something. They've got a vision for something. And that fear is keeping them back, because they look at all the other people who are doing quote unquote extraordinary things. And I want to tell those people who are listening to this right now, like, you don't know what you're capable of, but you will never get there if you don't start. And really, like the thing I want to make a point on in this particular section is like, don't worry about the fact that this creativity to you right now might seem mysterious. Like, just understand the formula and then follow it, and then these things will come. Like, it's going to take care of itself as long as you've got the right mindset. Yeah, you can't just hit publish and expect to get 1,000 downloads of your podcast or a bunch of social shares on your blog post just because you threw it out into the world. But if you throw it out there and then somebody says something and you look at it and you say, well, I could develop this particular skill a little bit better. I could improve my voice. You know, when I first started podcasting, I almost didn't because I hated my voice. I hated hearing my own voice. And I still don't really like hearing myself talk. But I get comments from people now who are like, I think you've got a really good podcast voice. I'm like, really? Like, but a lot of that is just because I've been doing it long enough, and I've been going to Toastmasters, and I get up and I've learned the voice inflections and to bring the energy and to talk with my hands and all this type of stuff. Like, if you go back to the first thing I did, I look at it now and I'm like, well, that was garbage. But I didn't view it that way at the time, and I also didn't view that as the ceiling for what I could do. It was just like, okay, I'm going to throw this out there. This is the very best I can do right now, and I'm not going to be ashamed of that. It is what it is, and if you're going to compare it to somebody like David Sparks or Joe Bulig at the time, like any of these other people who I look up to, my quote-unquote internet heroes, like, yeah, I'm not as good as them, and maybe I'll never get to that point, but I don't know until I try.
Which begs the question, what about natural talent?
Natural talent is garbage. No, this is an interesting section because we see this played out in almost every single arena. So he uses the example here of musicians. He uses the example of athletes. Those are probably the two biggest things where I think people kind of view like either you're born with it or you're not. Like, you hear the stories in if you're a musician of Mozart when he's 5 and his dad plays like a chord on the piano and it's got one wrong note, and he runs downstairs and he plays the same chord with the corrected note, and we think like that's crazy. But when he talks about in this section is that even those quote unquote prodigies, like, they have to apply this deliberate practice principle, and they're not just born with this. They have to follow the same formulas as everybody else. And yeah, maybe you have some more natural ability that makes it easier at first, but this principle of deliberate practice more than makes up the difference. And the biggest limiting factor that people have is their limiting beliefs about themselves. They've accepted the fact that they quote unquote can't do something. He mentions that 1/6 of adults think that they are tone deaf. And because they think they are tone deaf, they are tone deaf. But they don't have to be tone deaf. And in fact, a lot of them are not really tone deaf. They just have said this about themselves, and so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I think that this is something that you could apply to any arena. I'll just use an example of myself as a musician. I mentioned when I was 5 years old, I was in the Suzuki program. I learned to play classical music. I could read notes on a page. I could play technically very, very well. I went away to college, met some other musicians. They're like, hey, come on over, let's jam. And I was like, what? Like, where's the sheet music? Even just like chords on the page, I had trouble playing along with those, but I've learned to jam. I've learned to improvise. It's a very different set of skills, but it's something that you can apply this deliberate practice to. And, that's one small example of when you're becoming a musician, like there's different avenues and that you can go down, and there's different specific skills that you can develop through this concept of deliberate practice. That was something that even though like on the surface, people would look at me and like, well, you're a pretty skilled violinist. You put me in a room and asked me to do it a little bit different way, I was completely uncomfortable. That really helped me realize that, there's more to being a musician than being able to play the notes on the page. And I think that like you can apply that skill, and really you have to apply that skill if you want to become an expert in any given field. There's going to be things, to your point earlier, where you mentioned, like, I see these things that I need to improve. I think that you're playing this out in your own arena then. But don't accept the fact that just because you can't do this thing right now doesn't mean that you can't develop the ability to do that. You just got to figure out the right thing to focus on. Maybe you got to get a coach or a tutor who can show you the right things to do. But this deliberate practice more than makes up any natural talent deficiency you may have.
I think there's sometimes that we have we may have limiting beliefs we don't know about, but sometimes like I may know that I have a limiting belief, but it's not in an area where I really feel like doing anything about it. So,
Yep.
like, okay, well, I am not a singer and don't claim to be. Could I get better at it? Probably. Do I have a limiting belief on it? Maybe. Maybe not. I'm not terrible.
If you think you're not a singer, you do have a limiting belief, but whether or not you choose to overcome it is completely fine and completely up to you.
I am not going to take the time to continue to work at my ability to sing. I'm just not. Will I take the time to get better at running sound and running live performances? Sure. Yeah, I'll do that because that's an area I care about. But I'm not too concerned about a limiting belief around my singing ability. Like, that is not a thing that I'm going to work on. So, like, do these limiting beliefs exist? Yes. Should you do something about them? I would say if you want to.
Exactly. If your goal, when growing up, if your dream was to become a singer, then yes, you should do something about that limiting belief because it's keeping you from doing what is inside your heart. But if it's something that you are completely fine with not being the greatest at, then don't do anything with it. I mean, you can't apply the 10,000 hour rule to everything that you do.
Right.
You got to pick and choose how you're going to invest your time, attention, your energy, your focus. I mean, these are all related to this whole idea. You can't deliberate practice every single thing that you're ever going to do. You're going to have to not be an expert at something, and that's completely fine. In fact, the more you specialize, the more valuable you become.
So, Mike, section 9, where do we go from here?
We learn to create mental representations. That's the important thing, I think. If you were to boil this book down into a single sentence, it is look for ways to create mental representations in the way that you practice anything. And if all you did was try to do that, then you've kind of activated the whole formula that's outlined in this book, in my opinion. The ability to create those mental representations, though, is extremely valuable, and that's something that I want to instill in my kids. I think this is something, and this could open up a can of worms, but he talks in this last section about the education system and how deliberate practice is focusing on the acquisition of specific skills, right? It's not just knowledge, it's things that you know how to do. That is absolutely not the way that you study for a test. Knowledge just for facts stays in your short-term memory. There is nothing that you gain long-term from that. And you can totally see this. I was this way. I'm a pretty good test taker. I could sit down with the book the night before and memorize everything, ace the test, and then a week later you ask me what was on it, and I have no idea. Because I never developed those mental representations. And so, that's what my big takeaway from this whole thing is I want to learn to do this more myself. I'm going to create some specific habits and rituals, which will help me to do that. And then also I want my kids to be able to develop this skill because that's what's going to make them excellent in whatever they decide to do.
That said, is there anything else you want to say on the book?
Well, we hear Mahali in this last section.
Every book has to have Mahali in it.
It's true.
It's a requirement.
Yeah. Last thing I'll mention here is page 257. There's a quote I liked. He said, "It is as if they are on a constant stimulating journey where boredom is never a problem because there are always new challenges and opportunities." I love this. I want to apply this myself. I want my kids to adopt this. And kids are a great acid test for this because think about it. What do you hear from kids all the time? I'm bored.
Yep.
If we're honest with ourselves, we say the same thing. That's why we veg out and watch Netflix for 8 hours and go through an entire season of whatever.
Speak for yourself.
I don't do that, but I'm saying people do that. I've honestly never understood the Netflix and the YouTube, here's the next show, next episode. I have trouble getting through one, but I do understand that this is a conditioned behavior. And I do think that boredom is not necessarily a bad thing, as we've talked about with the mindfulness. I forget which book that was that we read. More of Less, maybe. You got to give yourself space to just think. You can't just be busy all the time. But I do think that there's a lot of value in viewing the world through a lens that's I'm going to figure out how this works. I'm going to make the most of my time here. And I'm going to be fascinated with whatever problem or obstacle that comes before me because it's a challenge and an opportunity for me to grow.
All right. You ready for action items?
Let's do it.
Kat, you got 4 here. I have 2.
So there's a couple specific ones which you can hold me accountable for, a couple which you will never be able to hold me accountable for. So
Okay.
one of the things kind of related to that last section, but also he mentions this a little bit earlier, I want to teach my kids to look for why, not how. One of the authors that I really like, Ed Cole, who wrote the men's curriculum that we have at our church, said that the man who knows how will always have a job. The man who knows why will always be his boss. And I think that applies to this whole idea of excellence and peak. Like the whole theme throughout this book is like, if you really want to develop your skills, you got to understand why, not just how. And so I want to teach my kids to do that. I also want to instill in my kids what he calls a self-fueling, self-motivating drive for tremendous work. I define this as a standard of excellence. So there's a little bit of a two-edged sword, because a lot of people deal with like perfectionism and not shipping something because it's not quite ready. And I've been there too. But I think that's different than just doing the very best that you can. Really, that's what I want to instill here is like, don't mail it in. Give it your very best effort, whatever you're trying to do. So those are the two that there's no way you're going to be holding me accountable to.
All right.
The two that you can hold me accountable to are learn to type faster. So this was, I forget which section this was. Oh, the plateaus, I think.
Dvorak.
Eh.
Dvorak.
No, not Dvorak. But
Oh, come on.
that would drive me nuts looking at my keyboard and having the keys printed wrong. I just could not do that.
You can fix that.
But I do think, like, especially for somebody like me who writes a lot on their computer, that this would be a skill that would provide a lot of benefit. And I know that I've hit a plateau with my typing speed, and I've been okay with that. I know that there are tools out there. In fact, somebody sent me a promo code for some typing tutor on the Mac App Store. So I'm going to give that a shot, and I'm going to try to boost my typing speed by the time we record next. The other one that I want you to hold me accountable for.
Hold on. Before you do that, you need to check your iMessage. The complaint against Dvorak I need to address.
Keyboard cover for Mac. Yeah, unless you've got one for my code keyboard, it's probably not going to happen.
Oh, I bet I could do that too.
All right. Well, follow up. The other one is I want to start playing chess. I think that he shared a lot about how that's a great way to develop mental models, mental representations. That's something I used to do. I just got to find somebody to play with. Sounds like you used to play chess. So you in?
I am in. So this was one of my action items as well, as I wanted to get back into chess, but I was asking around for a few people to figure this out and did not find anyone. You will probably kill me to begin with. Just going to say that because it's been a while. Like, it has. But I want to get back into it.
Me too.
Is there like some app or something we can do this with? Because we are definitely not in the same area.
There's got to be an iOS version.
Okay.
I know that there's one called Really Bad Chess, which a lot of people were talking about. I'm not sure if that's like real chess.
Okay.
But I'll find something.
Okay. You find something. I will accept whatever and run with that. So I'm cool. I'm good with that. So that was one of my actions. I had the two. That was one of them, was to get back into chess. The other one was trying to apply deliberate practice to client management. And I don't really know what that looks like right now. I know that there are a few points of frustrations that I have with communication in general with client management processes. So I may be trying to solve some of that, but basically I need to nail down what that one area I need to focus on with client management is and work on that. So I'm essentially, this is a broader area to start applying to how I handle clients in my business. So that is my other one. I don't know what that looks like quite yet, but that is a thing that I would like to do.
Nice.
There you go. Author style and rating. I can go first on this one. I have a point here for style because it's been slowly occurring to me, the different types of books that we've been selecting, Mike, and how some of these they're written very concisely and they are designed to get a point across, to do it really well, but in the shortest amount of space that you can comprehend. And then there are other books like Peak that are more designed towards like a meandering journey across a topic. And how long is this one? 260 pages, just shy of, something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
It's not a short book, but personally I felt like it could have been significantly shorter and gotten the same points across. And part of this is I've been realizing that if you pick up a book that's written by doctors or PhDs or people who do research for a living, those are always going to be long, meandering journeys. And I think that I had false expectation on this book when I started, thinking it was one of these more concise, get a lot of points across type of book, and ended up on a meandering journey through a topic. And that made it hard for me to continue through some of those more difficult points. At least what I saw is more because I kept wondering, like, why are we talking about this again? Like, that was what I kept like. He has a ton of stories. It was, fairly easy to read. It wasn't like I was trudging through it. I just couldn't figure out why we were talking about certain things again. So that was my qualm with it. So I love the topic, and I love the concepts that are in here. I just felt like the writing style on it, I felt like I didn't do it justice. It could have been done a little bit better in that sense. So as far as a rating, I'm going to put it at a 4. Because from a writing style, I would put it lower than that, but from a conceptual level, I would put it higher than that. So the difficulties with rating things, but I'm going to leave it at a 4.0 on this case.
All right. Well, I can tell you, even with my rant, which was based off of less than half a page out of this 260-page book,
yeah,
I'm going to rate this a 5. I really enjoyed this book.
Wow.
The guys who wrote it are really, really smart. I didn't feel like they were making themselves out to be smarter than me, though. Like, I felt it was very approachable, even for somebody who doesn't really like the scientists explaining every single facet of every single thing.
Yeah.
I really, really enjoyed this. I got something out of every single chapter. I kind of thought, when I looked at the table of contents, because I know how to read a book now, thanks to Mortimer Adler, that like they would be repeating a bunch of stuff, and they did a little bit. But for the most part, I understood why they express things in different ways. It didn't I didn't feel like when I read a section, they didn't need to say this because they said this earlier. They always applied a different perspective to it, which I found to be fresh. So I really, really enjoyed this book. I'm really glad that you picked it. I'm really glad whoever recommended it. Definitely recommend another book, whoever you are. And I would definitely recommend this one to just about anybody. I think that this really has the potential to change your life if you really apply what they're talking about here. And I feel like they present it in a way where it really makes you feel that it's possible. And so I left this book feeling very encouraged. And I think that anybody who's new to this idea, they're not read deep work and a lot of the other books that we've read, like even so, this would be a great introduction to the topic.
So we've alluded to this a couple times, I think, at least early on, about episode 50, which will be next. Mike, we've had some ideas on it. I don't know how much of this you want to share.
I'll just tell you that if you tune in to Bookworm because you want to know what we think about books as kind of like a pre-screening for whether you should read them, whether it's worth your time, that episode 50 is going to be awesome.
It's going to be gold.
This is going to be the most, I don't want to say most value-packed episode, but basically if you're looking to grow your reading list with the very best books that are out there, you're going to want to tune in for this one. And we're also going to make another surprise announcement about how you can get those bookmarks.
Yeah, I'm excited about that part.
Got some things in the works. This is going to be cool. I've shown you some stuff, and I'm excited to share this with the world in next episode.
That'll be fun. So tune into that one for sure. So because episode 50 is a special one, I think that means 51 is your choice, Mike, since Peak was mine.
I thought so, but I wasn't sure. So I don't actually have a book for episode 51 yet.
What?
So get those recommendations in.
All right. So episode 50, you may have some ideas on that, but we have some cool ideas with it too. Mike will hopefully tell us next time what he's going to choose for episode 51. I have 52 picked, but that's 2 episodes out. We're not gonna divulge that. So that brings us to Gap books, Mike. What do you have for a Gap book?
I am reading right now Thou Shall Prosper by Daniel Lapin, I believe. He's a Jewish rabbi, And this is a book that Dave Ramsey recommends. He talked a lot about it when I was at the EntreLeadership Summit a few weeks ago as we're recording this. And it's been on my bookshelf for a long time. And I've been going through it. It's interesting. Daniel Lapin, he's talking about like the 10 commandments to wealth building, and he talks about it from a Jewish perspective, which I am not Jewish. But it is interesting because they have a spiritual reason to believe why they should be successful. And they are successful. It's a crazy percentage of the world's wealth that's controlled by a very small percentage of the Jewish population.
Yeah.
And I do think that there's a lot of truth to the fact that like they think they're going to be successful, so they are. It's a very enlightening read. I'm about halfway through it.
Nice. I picked up here a couple days ago a book, The Revenge of Analog, Real Things and Why They Matter by David Sachs. Partially because, and I may make this a Bookworm book at some point. We'll see. It's an interesting book. It talks about the return of vinyl records, the return of, paper notebooks and such. So you can probably guess why I'm interested in this. It even talks about the return of board games. So it's an interesting book. And the author, David Sachs, he is a writer and reporter for Bloomberg, Businessweek, New Yorker, those types of things. So he's a very good writer, very entertaining writer. So it's an easy book to read. So yeah, I recommend it. It's an interesting one.
Awesome. I've heard of that. I'm going to have to give that a shot.
Yeah.
All right. So if you want to recommend a book, you can do so at bookworm.fm/list. We'll give you a list of all of the books that we've covered, all of the ones that are recommended, all of the ones that are planned, and there'll be a button right next to that where you can recommend a book. I know you're going to talk about another way that people can recommend a book.
Yep. And that is on the Bookworm Club, which club.bookworm.fm. You can get there from bookworm.fm as well, just in the menu. But basically, that is our online community around the Bookworm podcast. And there's a fancy button in the top that says recommend that you can click on, and it will help you to create that topic for a new book. Whenever you do that, you can also vote for them once they are on that list. So if you recommend a book, make sure you click the vote button once you've done that. And the highest voted books are the ones that I tend to look at when I'm selecting what comes up next. And I'm getting ready to select like the next bank of 3 books because I tend to do it in batches like that. So get your recommendations in, get your votes in on those recommended books, and we'll have some of those start to come up here in the near future. That's one way that you can get involved in the community, but another way that you can help out the podcast, there's 2 ways, really. One is to click the links in the show notes for the episode, because those are Amazon links. So we get a little bit of a kickback on the particular books that you've bought through Amazon if you use those links. But you can also leave us an iTunes review. That helps out a lot and helps other people find us. And it's just a super helpful way to let us know how you feel about the show. So if you get a moment, click the link in the show notes, and you can leave us a review on iTunes.
All right. So thanks for joining us. Tune in next time for a crazy value-packed episode and find out how you can get your own Bookworm bookmarks. And we'll talk to you next time.